Hello, my name is Briar. Welcome to my channel where I am discussing my journey from being a passionate writer of fantasy novels to one day a published and passionate writer of fantasy novels. Today I'm going to be talking about the topic of overwriting versus underwriting your first draft. So I've heard a lot of people talk about overwriting or underwriting and how that really impacts their stories or how that impacts their writing process, and I wanted to give my take on it because I have experience doing both. First things first, what is overwriting and underwriting? So with overwriting, you end up with a first draft that is epically long, like over 100,000 words long, when your goal is to have a novel that's between 70 and 80,000 words. Underwriting is sort of the opposite, where you hash out all of the things that are happening in your story and you wind up with a first draft that is much tighter, much smaller. You sort of skip all the fluff and just hit maybe the major points of your story, and you end up with a first draft that is 40 to 50,000 words when again you're aiming for 70 to 80,000 words as your first book goal, whatever. I have done both of these things. I have overwritten a first draft and ended up having to cut so many words for later drafts of my story, and I have severely underwritten some drafts and ended up with stories that were skeletal in nature. They did not have at all the substance that they needed to stand on their own. So today I'm going to talk first about my experience with overwriting and what I see as the pros and cons of writing too much to start, and then my experience with underwriting and the pros and cons of writing that much smaller skeletal first draft. For overwriting, the first novel that I ever successfully finished was a draft of my young adult werewolf hunter story, which was significantly overwritten. When I finished that first draft, it was almost 130,000 words, and for a young adult fantasy style novel, I was aiming for closer to 75 to 80,000, and I ended up with 130,000. So I knew as soon as I saw the word count of that finished document that I had to cut a lot. And in my little baby author brain, I was thinking, how am I going to cut all of this hard work that I put into it? I've been working for 18 months trying to get this done, and now I have to cut it all to pieces. So I set it to the side and I didn't work on that novel for a couple months. And when I finally came back and reread it to start editing, I knew that I had overwritten it and there was a lot of fluff. Some things that contributed to my overwriting of that first draft was I worked on it for, I believe, 3 NaNoWriMo events. And NaNoWriMo is all about getting that 50,000 words or getting a significant word count in a small period of time. So by working on it so much with that word count focus, I would end up vamping a lot and going on long tangential diatribes about what the characters are wearing or what they're seeing or smelling, and I was really trying to focus on like the 5 senses of the world to make the story come alive, which is great and definitely something you should do when doing description, but I leaned into it way too heavily and I ended up being able to chop entire sections of pages of just these characters sort of navel gazing and not really doing anything but explaining what was happening and what the world was like, more for me as the author to know than for anything that the reader needed to know. Another thing that contributed to my overwriting was the fact that I had this novel plotted. I knew what the plot was before I started writing, and I knew like the important beats that I wanted to hit. And so it was just an expression of just getting these characters, getting to know the characters more, and how they would get to these plot points and how they would interact on the way to get to these plot points. So it was a lot of character development in service of the plot, more so than trying to reach certain plot points. It was like, how are these characters, these specific characters, going to make this happen? And so it was a lot of exploration in that way. So for me, The pros of overwriting my first draft was I did already know the characters very strongly by the time I finished that first draft. I had a very strong sense and connection to all 4 of my main characters, several of the characters who were secondary and appeared in maybe 2 or 3 scenes. I had such strong feelings and affinities for all of my characters that it became so much easier for me on rewrites and editing to really hone in on who those characters were and make them more impactful, because I knew them so very well from writing so much about them and their interactions and their perceptions of the world. A second thing that overwriting taught me was that I was very repetitive in my use of scenery. If I didn't know where a scene was supposed to be taking place, it happened in a parking lot. I don't know why so many scenes happened in parking lots, but there was the school parking lot, there was the mall parking lot, there was the parking lot at the park, there was a parking lot of a cafe, there was the parking lot of the police station. There were so many parking lots where important things happened. Upon rereading that first draft, I was able to really hone in, and I was able to make a couple of key areas of the world that my characters would frequent and cut out all of these random parking lots, because I didn't need to make the world that big for the first novel. So I was able to see where I was repeating themes and just have them take place either closer together in time so that they were also closer together in space, and I wasn't inventing 600 parking lots for them to have all these conversations in. The negative side of overwriting my first draft was it was very intimidating to start the editing process, because I did have almost 130,000 words to get through. So once I started rereading that, it was a big project. I had to reread the whole thing. I had to make notes about all of this in order to see what was important and how to condense it down, and find out that I had 16 parking lots in this story that didn't need to be there, and I could instead have 2 or 3 of important places instead of 100. And learning all those things was great, but the process of learning all those things involved a lot of overcoming of my own self-doubt and fear, because again, this was my first novel that I'd ever finished a draft of, and it was huge. So having to take on that project of editing it down into something that was more honed and more impactful, it was big, it was intimidating, it was scary, and that was the biggest issue that I faced personally when it came to overwriting my first draft, because I knew the characters, I knew the setting, I knew the plot, I knew what was happening, and I had all the pieces that I needed to make it better and stronger and more cohesive, and it was too much. It was overwhelming to tackle that editing project. So that's definitely my biggest con about overwriting your first draft. For my experience with underwriting the first draft, that's where all of my straight non-rebel NaNoWriMo experiences come in, because NaNoWriMo is where you're trying to write 50,000 words in a month. 50,000 words is not enough to be a real complete novel unless it's middle grade or you're going for something of a shorter length. But again, I try to aim to get my novels between 75 and 90,000 words. 90,000 is like the high end. So starting to write something that is 50,000 words, I know it's not going to be complete. But I also kind of want to start and finish something in the month of November because it's kind of fun. The first straight up NaNoWriMo that I ever completed and won was a story where I had the characters fairly well developed and the plot sort of. I had a couple plot points that I wanted, but it was mostly the characters that I'd spent any of my prep time on. When November 1st hit, I just started writing. So I basically pantsed that story for the month of November, and I ended up finishing it with about 52,000 words. That was significantly shorter than the previous first draft that I'd written, which was almost 130,000 words, and this one was barely 50,000 words, and the comparison between the two was stark. When writing my underwritten first draft, I wrote it fast. I had my characters, I had my premise, and I had some sort of ending point that I wanted to get to, and I had no idea what was in the middle. So the process of writing it was really, these characters need to have an adventure, and just sort of throwing whatever at my characters to see what they would do, and if that would take them to somewhere interesting or not. And a lot of this ended up being stuff that got cut out because it wasn't even particularly useful. Upon finishing that first draft of my underwritten novel, I almost immediately dove into edits because it was significantly shorter and it felt so much easier to just reread the whole thing and see what worked and what didn't. And in my edits, I discovered that what didn't work was one of the main characters that was consistently throughout the novel did not need to be there and was superfluous fluff, so I had to rewrite the whole thing and take her out. The middle portion was weird and rambling and useless. The beginning of the novel started in a weird place, and so I actually had to back up and start at a different place in order to give that premise more meaning. So basically, when rewriting this underwritten draft, I had to cut out the entirety of Act 2, write a new Act 1, and my present Act 1 became Act 2, and completely cut out a pivotal character and assign her roles to my other two characters. It was a lot, but it was a lot more manageable because what I'd started with was significantly shorter. I would say the biggest pros to underwriting your first draft is it's really plot focused. I was really spending a lot of time getting my characters to do things, to be active members of the story. That meant that they were really in charge of everything that was happening. They were driving the story forward. It wasn't me trying to reach something, it was the characters making choices, and so they were more active characters, which is great. That also meant the stakes of the story were a lot higher from the get-go because it wasn't so much meandering trying to figure out like who the characters were and the slow meandering and pulling things to molasses pace of finding out who the characters were and exploring the setting. It was just, they were in a place, the end, moving on. And that made the story move faster, and it made it easier for me to see what plot points were important and what could be cut out on rewrites. The cons for writing really fast is that I didn't have that scope until rewriting the story to see what wasn't working. When I was writing my overwritten story, I was able to see rather quickly like, oh, this character's not really necessary, and so I just stopped including them and made a note that this character can be completely cut out in my rewrites later. But when writing both fast and not including a whole lot of detail, it was a very sort of macro lens of my story. I only saw what was happening on the page and maybe a couple pages before or after. I didn't have that pulled back view of the entire arch of the story. I just had get to the next plot point and keep going from there. So I didn't get to see that, and that meant there was an entire act in the middle of the story that ended up being cut out because it was useless. I guess the cons were really in the story writing process. I didn't have that big view of the world, but it was also a pro because it was so small that once I did finish the first draft and go back to rewrite it, I could take a step back and see all of that more clearly because there wasn't so much fluff to tear through and see the gems in. It was a lot easier to excavate out the good story from the crap first draft. So the main takeaways for me when looking at overwriting versus underwriting your first draft: overwriting is great for exploring characters, setting, really developing the world of your story. And I found it to be easier to overwrite when I already had a plot of what the story was because I knew what big things were coming, but I needed to get to know the characters. Whereas underwriting was easier for me to do when I knew basically nothing but a couple characters and a premise, because I had to discover the characters, their interactions, the world, the plot of the story, where the ending was, where the middle was. I had to discover everything, and I wasn't allowing myself to get caught up in talking about what the characters see, hear, smell. All of that came in on second draft, third draft, when I was rewriting the entire thing. But in that first draft, it was really easy to just make a note of, I'll write this later, and push forward. For me, I have a preference for overwriting versus underwriting. And when making the script of this video and making the bullet points about what I wanted to talk about, I came to the conclusion that I really enjoyed overwriting, because the fluff of it all is really fun for me. Like, I like diving more into my characters and their motivations and how they're interacting with the world around them. So in that sense, I really do enjoy the process of overwriting. But when it comes to actually finding the best thing for my stories, I think I am better if I underwrite the first draft. Because if I overwrite the first draft, it took me a year to get through one edit of my werewolf hunter story. A year. In that same time frame, I rewrote my underwritten first draft that I just wrote in November. I rewrote that 3 times. Once to remove a character, once to add the entirely new first act, and again to make the ending more impactful and raise the stakes of the plot. I rewrote that entire novel 3 times in a year, whereas I edited the first draft into the second draft of my Werewolf Hunter. So for speed, I would say underwriting is my best bet. For getting to know the characters, overwriting is my best bet. Which is best for you? Should you overwrite your first draft? I think if it's your first novel, yes, because you need to learn what does and doesn't work for you, and the best way to do it is to write. All words are good words if you can cut them out later. Whereas if your goal is speed and coming up with a good story faster, and editing it into a good story faster, I would say underwriting is better for me personally, because my first draft is crap. It is terrible. It is fluff, fluff, fluff. Nothing really happens, and I skip the important parts. Which I guess is also good for underwriting. Because I just write, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I bridge the gap in the middle, and maybe I should work on that. That's fun. Ideas are coming. So what is best for you? I don't know. Have you underwritten your novels? Overwritten your novels? Have you written your novels? Have you written today? I think everybody should get something on paper. I need to go because it is currently Camp NaNoWriMo, and I only just finished, not even Act 1, Chapter 1 of my story. So I need to get into writing Chapter 2, which is when things start happening. All right, let me know in the comments down below what you think about overwriting versus underwriting. Is this something you've ever even thought of before? Or is this a new topic? Because people are always talking about plotters versus pantsers, but are you an overwriter or an underwriter? My next video should be out in the end of this week. Fingers crossed. So far, this whole planning of videos has been working pretty well for me. Let's hope I keep it up. Also, if some parts of this video are shaky or interrupted, my dogs have gone crazy. So, I plan to edit that out, but I always like to include a disclaimer because sometimes the plans aren't planned that well. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Problem.